Almost any time that anyone asks me what my favorite anything is, my answer is, it depends. It's not very satisfying usually for the asker, but I need more context to answer that question. Where's your question coming from? Is it a hypothetical? Is it concrete? For example, when we hear the ice cream truck coming down the street at our house, someone in the house hollers, "Ice cream, what do you want?" Because we love the ice cream truck. But even that answer depends. I may not go through the whole process with whoever's hollering at me in the house, but in my head, I'm asking myself, when did I last eat? Or when are we having our next meal? If we're going to eat it right now, do I have any of my gluten-free ice cream cones available to take out there? Or if I'm going to set it in the freezer for later, do I want a bowl of something? Or would I rather get a milkshake? Even the question of flavor choice, chocolate or vanilla soft serve, is relative to whatever I've eaten most recently, among other things. Who knew Mr. Softy could drive up with so much baggage, right? Kind of like when people ask each other, "How are you?" and we don't necessarily want the answer. Whether we're consciously aware of it or not, any time that we're making a choice, that choice has a background context from which it originates. It never is happening in a vacuum. It could be simple. It could be complex. Regardless, that context gives shape to the answer. The answer is dependent on the things that precede it. As has often been said, the context is decisive, not the content. Being able to discern context is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding ourselves and others more deeply. Listening on purpose from a place of openness and connection is what grants us access to that deeper discernment. Now, content could just be considered to be facts or events. Context is the background or setting in which those occur. If content, in a certain sense, is our who, what, when, and where, then context is our why. And even that's a gross oversimplification, because that why can be given by so many different things. We touched on some of those things in the responsive reading that we did as our meditation. Some of the tougher stuff, the deeper chasms between us, things born of suffering. I have a tendency to dive right into that ouchy stuff. And we were going to have ourselves a talk all about that today. But the world seems to be falling apart around our ears lately. And I was out of town yesterday for the funeral of a high school friend that I meant to reconnect with and missed the chance to. So I know I could use a little break from talking about the really hard things, and maybe today you could too. After all, some people observe this as a holiday weekend, I understand. So you're going to get a somewhat different message today than what I'd originally planned. We're still talking about context and deep listening and such, but hopefully with a lighter touch. Hopefully it will make sense, and hopefully it won't take me an hour and a half to get through it. I promise it won't take an hour and a half. I mean, I could, if you all want us. So I, like so many other people, come from a family context that shows love and care through food. Anybody relate? Yeah. When my mother died over the winter holidays in 2000, it was no surprise to me that people offered food. In fact, any number of articles have been written about the seemingly universal human drive to comfort and nurture the grieving with food. Now, one memory from that time rises above all the rest. I'd moved out of my parents' house about 6 months before my mother's passing, but I'd been staying at their house while she was dying, and then for a while through the funeral. My dad, who was still in practice as a pulmonologist at that time, was over at the hospital for a half day helping to cover rounds, and I was the only one at home when the doorbell rang. I went to answer it and found an older woman from our church standing on the front porch bearing a large serving bowl. Now, when I say large, I mean that kind of faux cut crystal plastic serving bowl that you would see a fluffy green salad in, maybe at a potluck. Especially a Midwestern church potluck. She explained, as many did around that time, how much my mom had meant to her, how sorry she was for our loss, and that she'd wanted to just bring us a little something to eat, with enough to share, for visiting family and so forth. I'm an only child, and so was my mother. So believe me when I tell you that my introvert father and I were neither gathering with family nor taking large groups of visitors. Did I mention this was a big bowl? So at first quick glance, I thought that it was indeed a vibrant green salad. Good. She warmly explained to me how it was a family favorite at times like these because it was so comforting and nutritious. And she said she'd made it even more so because she'd been sure to use sugar-free Jell-O. I'm sorry, wait, Jell-O? She said Jell-O. So let's just pause for a moment. Now, when I say Jell-O salad, being a child of the 80s, I figure you have the same context that I do, right? A Jell-O mold with something suspended in it, maybe some canned fruit, right? Jell-O salad. And as someone who had a brief sojourn living in the Midwest, it might even have some kind of dairy products added to it, either in whole or in layers. In fact, I quite gladly ate a good bit of Jell-O salad as a kid and when I lived in the Twin Cities. This, my friends, was not that. And when she said the word Jell-O, I really saw what was in the bowl. And it struck me less as food and more as, I don't know, let me be graphic, Christmas elf vomit, crushed Grinch. What I was looking at was a concoction of crushed lime Jell-O, sugar-free, tossed with cottage cheese and crushed pineapple, and if memory serves correctly, there were little bits of maraschino cherry sprinkled throughout, which I had mistaken for tomatoes. Not tomatoes. And it was being proffered with the greatest love, kindness, and care for me and my father. I still had some manners left and some semblance of a poker face back then. That's long gone. So I thanked her from the bottom of my heart, and I assured her I would make sure to save some for my father when he got home from helping with rounds. Did I mention big bowl? I carried that sucker into the kitchen and set it down on the part of the counter that jutted out, sort of made a pseudo island. There was no room for it in the fridge, so one way or another, it was going to stay right there until we figured it out. And I happened to be in the kitchen when my dad got home, and he walked up to the bowl and sort of blinked at it. And I stood there and said, "Yep, Mrs. So-and-so brought it by. She said she used sugar-free Jell-O." I vividly remember even the quality of the winter light coming through the windows and the way that we stood at 90-degree angles around the counter, just looking at it. I guess we should try some. How bad could it be? Well, I guess that depends. It actually tasted okay. And had it been the blended molded version more common on what my friends tell me are Midwestern and Southern holiday tables as green salad, I wouldn't call it that, it might have been good. But it was a little tough to get past the chunky, soupy green visual. And the curds of cottage cheese, slightly fibrous pineapple bits, and irregularly shaped chunks of broken up Jell-O created an unsettling grouping of textural contrasts, both to eye and to mouth. And then there was the sound as it slid from the serving spoon to the dessert bowls, a sound perhaps more native to the bathroom of a frat house after a wild party. We'll just leave it there. Dad said, "Put some in a smaller Tupperware. I'll try to eat some over the next few days." I asked what to do with the rest of it. Did he want to maybe take it into the office to share with his practice partners and office staff? And he said, "No, I think it's best not to put that kind of strain on those relationships." I miss him. So why am I talking to you about funeral Jell-O salad? Partly because I was at a funeral yesterday, and this story was better and lighter than the one I had. But also because that bowl, in the context of a 50-person or 100-person potluck, would be utterly unremarkable. It would be on the table, it wouldn't be an unusual size, and probably the contents would disappear over time. But in the context of two people, these two particular people, my dad and I, to quote my college bestie, that's not the kind of help that helping's all about. Whether we're the ones asking for help or the ones offering the help, context is decisive. So some of you may know that I had major surgery for this spring, for which I am deeply grateful. I was amazed at how much better I felt even one day after my hysterectomy than I felt the day before. I had no idea how much pain and dysfunction I had thought was just becoming normal, that I was just going to have to live with, and how little help I'd allowed myself to even consider asking for, much less receiving. In contrast, I knew I would likely need some help in the time frame immediately after surgery, but I'd never had major surgery. I didn't have any internal context for that. So I had to ask other people what I might imagine that I might need. What might be the most helpful thing, I was asked. Well, it depends. Helpful to me physically, directly, helpful indirectly to my spouse and my daughter, helpful in week 1 or helpful in week 4 or 8 or 10. So it can really take something to make space for the kind of understanding that's needed to really hear other people's needs and to meet them where the need is. In the weeks prior to surgery, a good number of people came forward to ask me how they could help, and I had no idea. What I did know was they could not help by bringing food. What I did know was that because I had food allergies, other people bringing food, while well-intentioned, was kind of a minefield. So it wasn't even because I was afraid to be served crushed Grinch. That well-meaning but unasked for casserole might mean that my spouse and my daughter would have some easy meals ahead, but somebody somehow was still going to have to feed me with ingredients that were known and safe, at which point they may as well just cook for all three of us. Your earnest, caring context that says, but I love you, I'll be careful. That butts up against my context that says, everyone makes mistakes sometimes, and a mistake here could make me really sick, cause me pain, or send me to the ER. Neither of us really wants that. What about a takeout gift card? Isn't that easier? Well, it depends. Finding a restaurant menu with safe items and making sure they're reading my allergy notice on the order is not the most reliable thing. So, yep, even ordering for takeout is fraught. Let me tell you, it was hard to tell the people that I loved and who loved me that they couldn't bring me food. I get existential hives when someone tells me I can't give them food. I live for feeding people. But I have enough friends with food allergies that I don't take that no personally anymore, because I finally understood and adopted a context that says their well-being is more important than my pride or my desire to contribute to them. And still, some people get put out when the help that they've offered is turned down for whatever reason, because they're stuck in their own context for giving. If their drive to help is coming from a context of wanting to feel good about helping, that's about meeting the helper's need, not meeting the need of the person in need. Not so much about understanding what that kind of help is really all about. I know well that understanding takes work, and it's work that's never really done. I'm someone who always wants to know what makes something or someone tick. I am incessantly curious and talkative. So I'm always asking questions and then coming up with new things and new ideas. What about this? What about that? And even so, that curiosity does not automatically give me insight into anyone else's context. I have to listen on purpose. For some of us, admitting that we might not already know might make us feel inadequate or embarrassed out of a false belief that somehow we just should already magically know. And when we need to share context around a need we are having and need to express for ourselves, we may feel vulnerable or exposed. That's hard enough when we're dealing with things that seem cut and dry without a lot of charge on them. Add on personal or cultural baggage, privilege, power imbalances, that gets messy. So that question, how are you? Yeah, it depends. Do you want the real answer, the honest answer, with the necessary context for it to make sense to you? Or are we just doing the social nice thing? Yeah, we've all been there. There's nothing wrong with it. But it helps to know if we're both on the same page. And I've noticed that when I proactively share context answering that question, sometimes people get annoyed. I didn't need to know all that. Except that my lived experience tells me that, yeah, probably they did need to know all of that. And if they didn't, I needed them to know for some reason. And if I'm going to give an honest answer that makes any sense, I'm probably going to say it. Maybe they didn't want to hear it because somehow they knew that knowing might mean they'd have to make a shift. Or maybe they were just really certain they understood and they couldn't bear to learn that they might be wrong. And I've been all those people at one point or another, and maybe you have too. I think most of us heard the golden rule growing up, right? How many of you have heard of the platinum rule? Right, like I hadn't either. Until last week, courtesy of my friend, Reverend Catherine Clarenbach, whose pronouns are Faye, Fair, Fairs. I asked Faye to whom I should credit this, and Faye said that even Faye was not sure where it had come to Fair from. They were really glad that they'd heard about it. So the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or as you would have done unto you. Okay. Platinum rule, do unto others as they would have done unto themselves, or as they would do unto themselves. Now, the golden rule always seemed easy enough, right? Figure out what you'd want and then just do that to someone else. Except we live in a new age now where consent is kind of a thing. So that sort of says that the way to get along is assume that what works for you, the context that you're operating from, is the context they're operating from too, and therefore will work for them. It sounded so good and so easy at first, didn't it? Except it's just not. Because it centers the helper, even in the act of serving others. And whatever it is, it may not be what they asked for at all. I mean, it's better than nothing when you truly cannot know how they would have done unto themselves, but it falls short. Meanwhile, the platinum rule requires that we get interested in doing the work to learn and understand what others would do unto themselves, how they would have done unto themselves, not what we think they should want. Honestly, this is where using people's pronouns is a thing. Knowing what their pronouns are and using what they've asked for instead of arguing for why their pronouns are wrong. Do unto them as they would do unto themselves. Use our strengths, our deep listening and understanding to support others in ways that preserve their dignity and honor their strengths. And even in time of need, it's a key component of interdependence. We can't talk about interdependence without also giving at least cursory consideration of the context that we have for independence and dependence. And I promise it's not 6 pages long. Interdependence sometimes gets simplified, oversimplified as mutual dependence, but that also assumes we've cleaned up our context for dependence. Interdependence has a flavor of being supportive and supported without being subordinate to one another, working together for the common good without losing sight of the individual strengths, needs, and goals. And when getting needs met is contingent on someone else doing something for us that we cannot do for ourselves, that's dependence. And we have some cultural issues with that. It gives us an ugly off flavor when it rolls around in our mouth. We don't want to be dependent on someone else. We don't like the power dynamic that creates. We like to think of independence as having a flavor of autonomy and centeredness, not being adversely influenced by others, but we tend to cling to that so tightly that we just accept the disconnection of it without any sense of being responsible for what that disconnection costs us, individually and collectively. And as you use, we cling to our independence pretty tightly. And I am so over the toxic over-attachment to independence. I want interdependence. I want that to function. It requires clarity around shared context, which means you've leveled up from understanding individual context already, right? And that awareness requires deep listening, a desire to understand, a willingness to put ourselves in someone else's context, no matter how vulnerable that makes us feel, and making space for that other and their vulnerability too, which is so much more challenging if something's been unsettling, like, I don't know, collective and personal trauma from an ongoing global pandemic, anyone? There are some clarifying questions we can ask ourselves and others to tease out the nuances of context. Who's in need? What is that need, whether expressed or implied? How strong or how urgent is that need? And how emotionally charged is it? Or the means of meeting it, for that matter? Am I or they even open to receiving help? And if the answer to any of those is, it depends, then what other questions do we need to be asking? They may be simple, but they're not easy questions. Often we fall short in our efforts, individually and as a community, towards interdependence. As a society, we're not good at dealing with vulnerability in ourselves and others at all. When it gets too scary, we just kind of roll off into toxic overdrive independence so that we don't have to be impacted and influenced by what's going on over there. When what we could be doing is establishing more open communication, clear accountability, healthy boundaries. And I have talked way too long, and I'm going to try to wrap it up fast. So it's a tall order, this whole living our principles thing. Are we willing to be responsible when we fail ourselves or others and address the impacts of those choices and actions, instead of just writing it off as good intentions gone awry? Well, I didn't mean to hurt you. Well, it's too bad. You did. Are we willing to nurture the necessary context for interdependence? Or will we default to the seemingly safer disconnection of independence, or spiral into shame or judgment grounded in those deeply toxic societal or familial beliefs that demonize even momentary dependence? Are we willing to hold ourselves and others to account and also bring clarity and grace to that? Can we do that while granting a healthy measure of loving kindness and care to everyone, even ourselves, knowing that we're all just doing the best we know to do at the time? How many of you just thought to yourselves, well, it depends? When we have new ways of thought, feeling, and action modeled to us, we have a better chance of granting ourselves permission to try doing things differently, and giving ourselves the space to discern the unknown pieces of context that will inform the next choice, the next action. It's often said that if we knew better, we would do better. May we all know a little better and do a little better today than we did yesterday, to expand our capacity for vulnerability, to build healthy interdependence in our families, in our communities. And when things aren't quite as clear as we hoped, may we grant ourselves and each other the loving, peaceful, hopeful, even joyful space to hear the unspoken questions and answers that are inherent when we say, it depends.